Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Wednesday, August the 20th. And welcome to our commentary. Well, I guess the big story today is these maps in Texas. They're voting on that right now. They should be finished today, from what I understand, but it might go into tomorrow because sometimes there's all kinds of procedural things they got to go through. But they're going through it today, and the maps will be signed by Governor Abbott by the end of the week. The maps will be changing the composition of the congressional delegation. They will be adding four more districts in South Texas in Hispanic majority areas. And they're also going to be adding another district, I believe, in the Houston area. But, overall, this is obviously a good move by the governor. It's completely constitutional. And yes, it's going to be helping President Trump in the sense that he's going to have five more, very likely going to have five more Republican districts. So in any kind of a competitive congressional, midterm election, having five more is it's a good insurance policy. That's I'm sure what the calculus is. I do think there's a couple of factors, though, behind these maps, more than just the political component. I do think that you have to take into account the increase in Texas population over the last 5 years, and especially all of those people who are moving into central Texas. I think you have to take that into account, and the changes in South Texas when it comes to the Hispanic vote. So I think those are factors also that have to be taken into consideration. And I'm pretty sure that they were by the governor and the Republican majority here in Texas. But the maps will become effective for 26 as soon as the governor signs the new law. And then, of course, what's going to happen in California? Everybody, I was on Univision this afternoon, and they were asking me about that. And I don't know what's going to happen in California. I mean, I think they want to be able to basically cancel five Republican districts out there, and instead of 9, bring it down to 4. Well, we'll see how it goes. Their process is a little bit more complicated than our process. They're going to have to, as I understand, they have a referendum that comes up in November where the public has to accept that they're doing this. The voters have to accept that they're doing this. I've heard all kinds of opinions about this. I've heard some people say that this is a huge gamble for the governor, Governor Newsom out there. Other people are saying that it's not going to be a problem because the Democrats control the vote and they'll get it done. I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen. I've also seen commentaries coming out of California that if they have this vote in November and it passes, if it passes, then it's going to get into all kinds of legal challenges. That there are some people out there who are already preparing legal challenges against this because they're basically saying to the people of California, give us the authority to go around the rules. And I don't know if that's going to be accepted. I don't know. It's completely different than the process here in Texas that was as simple as the governor saying, hey, I've got the votes, I've got the maps, let me have a session and call for a vote. So it's totally different here, much easier, to be honest, than it is out there in California. Well, we'll see. We'll see probably by November, I guess. We'll see what happens in California. But in the meantime, Texas is moving in the direction of changing the maps. I think Ohio is going to do the same. Indiana is thinking about doing the same, and I believe Florida is thinking the same. So, there could be some interesting changes in the congressional maps for 2026. We'll see how everything works out, after people vote. There have been some interesting things happening in Latin America, and we're going to have a show next week. We're going to have a video next week with a special guest, a very special friend of our show. And we're going to talk about, I'll confirm it in the next few days when we're going to do it. But we're going to be talking about two recent developments in Latin America, Venezuela and Bolivia. In Venezuela, the Trump administration has decided to get very tough with the Maduro regime. In fact, they're basically saying this is not a legitimate regime. And they're working very hard to, in the background to see how they can change the regime. We've put some military forces in the area, and I don't think they're going to be used necessarily, but we believe Secretary Rubio has indicated that this is not a legitimate regime, and this is a narco regime, meaning the government of Maduro, and we don't accept the election results. So it looks to me like we're going to get very serious, but very serious with Maduro. And frankly, if the wisest thing that Maduro could do, I think, would be to get the heck out. I remember that he was offered exile in Panama, to go to Panama and live there. And that might be the best thing he could do at this point, is to get out and go to Panama and live there, because he might get overthrown and perhaps even eliminated in any kind of radical change. So that might be the best thing for him. But clearly, the Trump administration is not going to be working with the Maduro administration. And that, I think it's a good thing. It sends a good message to Venezuelans, especially Venezuelans who voted the way they did and saw their election turn into a mockery whenever that was, a year or so ago. It's also a very bad message for Cuba. I mean, this is a very bad message for Cuba, because they depend a great deal on support from Venezuela, oil supplies and that kind of thing. The other very interesting thing happened in Latin America is these elections that they just had in Bolivia. They had presidential elections. Nobody got 50%. There was going to be a runoff. But here's the fascinating thing. The two candidates who are going to be in the runoff are two candidates from the right. Now, I don't know too much about these two men. All I know is that they obviously come from the right. This particular election in Venezuela was a huge loss for the left in Bolivia, and in particular Evo Morales, who has been the face of the left in Bolivia. I mean, he has really been defeated completely in these elections. It was not a good day for the left in Bolivia. And I'm not familiar with these two candidates. Generally, I know they're from the right, and they sort of have more free market ideas and so on. And that's one of the reasons that we'll be joined. I'll let you know the details later in the next day or two with a guest who's going to talk to us about Venezuela and talk to us about Bolivia and talk to us a little bit about Cuba, because that situation in Cuba is getting more and more dreadful every day. Shortages of everything going on in Cuba, and that's a terrible thing. I've got a post at American Thinker today talking about the situation in D.C., Washington, D.C., and what a tremendous improvement we've seen just in the short time that the Guard has been there. What a tremendous improvement we've seen in crime. And I asked the question in my post, who would have believed that adding additional forces and arresting criminals would have an impact on crime? And I guess it does. And clearly, people feel safer in Washington, D.C. because of this move. And I think the Democrats, as I point out in my post, have miscalculated tremendously the situation in this D.C. They wanted to get into a debate about statistics. Debating statistics doesn't do you any good when the streets are not safe. And everybody knows that. I mean, everybody who lives there, who works there, who goes outside, who goes out to dinner knows that it's a very unsafe city. And I think President Trump's decision, which is a short-term decision, of course, because you can only do this for 30 days. But nevertheless, it was a very smart move and a completely common sense move. And I think you're going to see this idea of securing our cities go into other cities like Chicago and Baltimore and so on, cities that are suffering from a huge wave of crime. And I think you're going to see that going on down the road. But of course, it's different in Washington, D.C., because it's a federal city. and the president has the authority that he doesn't have in other cities where he would have to go through the governor and so on. But, clearly the idea that you want safe streets, I think that resonates with a lot of people who live in these extremely crime-ridden cities, well, Washington, D.C., of course, Chicago, which is a disaster, Baltimore, which is a disgrace. I mean, the crime in many of these cities. So I think we're going to be hearing a lot more from President Trump about crime in the city. Well, let me leave you today by going back to this week in 1968. Most of you are not going to remember this, but it was this week that the Soviet Union intervened in Czechoslovakia. There was a liberal movement in Czechoslovakia. It was called the Prague Spring, and it was led by Alexander Dubček, who was a politician who wanted to reform Czechoslovakia and just make it a little bit more democratic. And he got pretty far, actually. But eventually the Soviet Union, through the Warsaw Pact, intervened and put down the movement, if you will, the freedom movement. And that shut this down. And Czechoslovakia didn't get a chance to be free, much like Hungary was intervened in 1956 by the same Soviet Union and the same Warsaw Pact. So I remember this week a little bit because my father had a friend from Czechoslovakia who worked with him at the bank. And I remember hearing my father and his friend talk about what was going on in Czechoslovakia. But, it was a tragedy. The Soviets came in and put down this rebellion. And they did it again in 1980 when they put down the rebellion in Poland. But by then, I think people were starting to change. And of course, in 1980, you had the Pope, John Paul II, who became a player in Poland at the time. So, eventually all these countries, 56 Hungary, 68 Czechoslovakia, Poland in 1980, eventually they were able to walk away and become free, independent countries. But it was a very painful history. And what happened today in Czechoslovakia in 1968, or this whole week really, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, was another sad reminder of the dreadful history of communism in many of these countries. So we remember today the brave people of Czechoslovakia who stood up to Soviet tanks this week in 1968. Thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.